Top 5 real-life criminal minds that shocked the world. The explosion tore through the government quarter like a sudden rupture in time. Windows bowed outward, then shattered, raining glass across the street. Smoke rolled upward in a gray column that cut through the summer sky above Oslo. Phones rang without answers. Sirens converged from every direction, colliding in a single, confused scream. At first, no one understood what had happened. An accident. A gas leak. Construction gone wrong. That was the instinct, normalcy grasping for air. Then the reports came in. A car bomb. Deliberate. Calculated. As first responders secured the area, fragments of metal lay embedded in stone. Offices stood open and broken, papers drifting like leaves. People staggered through dust and alarms, their faces pale with shock. Oslo, a city known for calm order and trust, had been punched awake. Across the water, miles away, a ferry docked at Utøya Island. Teenagers laughed as they stepped onto the wooded shoreline, relieved to escape the heat of the city. It was a political youth camp, debates, speeches, late-night conversations about the future. The kind of place built on optimism. No one on the island knew what had just happened in Oslo. And that was exactly the point. Within minutes of the blast, emergency operations activated across Norway. Police scrambled to determine if there were more threats. The city braced itself, eyes scanning rooftops, subway entrances, parked vehicles. The assumption was simple and terrifying. If there was one attack, there could be another. Investigators worked the blast site with urgency. The device had been powerful, professionally assembled. Whoever did this hadn't acted on impulse. This wasn't rage. This was planning. CCTV footage was pulled. Witnesses were interviewed. A timeline began to form, piece by piece. The suspect vehicle had been parked with purpose. The location chosen for maximum visibility. For symbolism. As the investigation narrowed, a question surfaced that unsettled everyone involved. Where was the attacker now? On Utøya Island, the camp continued. Discussions about policy drifted into laughter near the water. Phones buzzed sporadically with messages from parents, but information was fragmented. The bomb? In Oslo? It didn't feel real from the quiet of the island. Then a man arrived. He wore a uniform. He looked official. Purposeful. He spoke with authority and asked for attention. He said he was there to ensure safety after the incident in Oslo. Trust followed. It always does when authority sounds confident. Minutes later, the illusion shattered. Panic erupted across the island. People scattered into the trees, hid behind rocks, pressed themselves into the ground. Phone calls turned frantic. Messages cut off mid-sentence. The sound that followed wasn't chaos. It was terror trying to outrun reality. Back in Oslo, police began receiving reports that made no sense at first. Another attack. Gunfire. An island youth camp. The calls overlapped, voices shouting over one another, struggling to explain something that felt impossible. Norway had prepared for disasters. It had not prepared for this. As officers mobilized toward Utøya, the scale of the situation remained unclear. Roads clogged with emergency vehicles. Boats were requested. Helicopters prepared for deployment. Every minute felt heavier than the last. On the island, survival became instinct. Groups split apart, believing distance meant safety. Some tried to swim. Others hid in buildings, whispering names, clinging to phones with dying batteries. The attacker moved methodically, unhurried, as if time itself had bent around him. He wasn't improvising. He was following a plan. By the time police reached the island, the damage was already devastating. The suspect surrendered without resistance. He was taken into custody alive. His demeanor was calm, composed. He followed instructions precisely. The contrast was unsettling. As survivors were evacuated, blankets wrapped around shaking shoulders, the full scope began to surface. Numbers climbed. Names were counted and recounted. Parents gathered at information centers, scanning lists with growing dread. 77 lives were gone. Norway stood still. In the days that followed, investigators searched for meaning in evidence. Computers were seized. Documents recovered. What they found revealed something more disturbing than rage, a manifesto, thousands of pages long, outlining ideology, grievances, and strategy. This wasn't a spontaneous act. It was an announcement. The suspect, Anders Breivik, had prepared for years. He studied previous attacks. He calculated responses. He anticipated attention. His goal wasn't just violence, it was amplification. Every step had been designed to be seen. As the world learned his name, debates ignited across continents. How could this happen in Norway? How had one person carried out such coordinated destruction alone? Was this a failure of intelligence, of trust, of imagination? Court proceedings only deepened the shock. Breivik didn't act like a man crushed by consequences. He treated the courtroom like a platform. He spoke deliberately, aware of cameras, aware of history unfolding around him. Psychologists debated his mental state. The public debated whether covering his words only served his purpose. Even in custody, he controlled the narrative. That realization frightened experts more than the attack itself. Behind the scenes, law enforcement reviewed every moment leading up to July 22, 2011. Purchases, travel, communications. Breivik had avoided detection by staying within legal boundaries until the final steps. He exploited assumptions. He hid in plain sight. He wasn't invisible. He was underestimated. Investigators pieced together his movements in the weeks before the attack, uncovering test runs, rehearsals, dry calculations that stripped emotion from action. Each discovery added another layer to a picture no one wanted to complete. The attack had not been inevitable. It had been allowed to grow. As the trial progressed, Norway faced a difficult question: how to respond without becoming what it feared. Justice without spectacle. Accountability without martyrdom. The country chose restraint, even as the world watched. Sentencing reflected that choice. But closure remained elusive. Survivors spoke about moments that replayed without warning. Families described times splitting into before and after. Investigators admitted that the case changed how they understood threat, how they weighed silence, how they imagined danger. Breivik's name became shorthand for a new kind of terror, one rooted in ideology, patience, and a chilling awareness of systems. And then, buried deep within digital archives recovered from his devices, analysts found something unexpected. A document dated months earlier than anyone had assumed. It wasn't a draft. It wasn't theory. It was a checklist. Locations. Timing. Contingencies. Notes on police response times. A line marked Phase 2, with alternatives that had never been publicly discussed. The implication was immediate and terrifying. What the world saw on July 22 wasn't the only version of the plan. And if investigators were right, it meant one final truth still hadn't surfaced. Because when they opened the last encrypted file, they realized something chilling. The story everyone thought they knew was only the version that succeeded. The encrypted file didn't scream violence. It whispered intent. Analysts stared at the screen as lines of text unfolded, lists, timestamps, logistical notes written with the detachment of a project manager. There were contingencies for delays, notes on public confusion, predictions about media cycles. It wasn't a diary. It was a framework. A blueprint built not around chaos, but around anticipation. Investigators realized something unsettling. The attacks were not the end goal. They were the opening act. Breivik had planned for attention the way others planned for escape. He had calculated the response, the outrage, the debates that would follow. He had anticipated condemnation and turned it into fuel. The manifesto wasn't meant to persuade everyone. It was meant to provoke everyone. In the weeks after the attacks, intelligence agencies across Europe exchanged information at a pace they weren't used to. Names were cross-checked. Online forums were monitored. Patterns were reassessed. Analysts searched for echoes, language, symbolism, timing that might suggest coordination or influence beyond one person. Nothing concrete surfaced. But the absence of a network didn't bring comfort. It raised a different fear. A lone actor with patience, resources, and ideological fixation could move undetected longer than any group. There were fewer signals to intercept. Fewer conversations to overhear. The silence itself became a warning sign. During the trial, Breivik leaned into that silence. He corrected prosecutors on dates. He requested specific terminology. He spoke as if the courtroom were an audience hall rather than a place of judgment. Judges maintained order. Attorneys objected. But the spectacle existed whether anyone wanted it to or not. Psychiatric evaluations divided experts. Some saw delusion. Others saw calculation. The question wasn't whether he understood what he had done. It was whether understanding had ever mattered to him in the way the law required. Survivors watched from the gallery, gripping the edges of their seats. They listened as ideology was discussed in abstract terms, as if words could explain the weight of loss. Some walked out. Others stayed, determined to witness every minute, refusing to let the narrative become detached from the human cost. Outside the courtroom, Norway argued with itself. How much coverage was too much? When did reporting become repetition? Could restraint prevent copycats, or did silence allow ideas to ferment unchecked? There were no clean answers, only choices that carried consequences either way. Behind closed doors, police reviewed their response to Utøya with brutal honesty. Timelines were reconstructed. Decisions examined. Every minute was accounted for, not to assign blame, but to learn. Boats. Helicopters. Communications. Each variable was weighed against the reality of terrain and confusion. The findings were uncomfortable but necessary. Improvements were outlined. Protocols revised. Training expanded. The country refused to look away from its own vulnerability. Yet one concern lingered. Breivik's writings didn't end with July 22. Hidden among the files were references to aftereffects, ways the attack would ripple outward, inspiring others who felt unseen, unheard, or radicalized in isolation. He predicted misinterpretations and welcomed them. He anticipated bans and restrictions and framed them as proof of his narrative. It was a strategy designed to survive imprisonment. As the trial neared its conclusion, intelligence units flagged a spike in online activity echoing fragments of his language. Not organized, not coordinated, but present. Analysts debated whether acknowledging it would inflate it or expose it. Either way, the shadow stretched beyond Norway's borders. When the verdict was delivered and the sentence announced, the courtroom held its breath. The punishment reflected Norway's principles, firm, restrained, rooted in law rather than vengeance. Some praised it. Others questioned whether restraint could ever match the scale of harm. Breivik accepted the sentence without visible reaction. In the days that followed, attention shifted to the victims, names, stories, futures interrupted. Memorials filled with flowers and handwritten notes. Survivors returned to the island together, not to reclaim it from memory, but to share it with one another on their own terms. Investigators closed primary files but left secondary ones open. The encrypted checklist remained under analysis, its implications debated late into the night. Every what-if carried weight. Every alternative path suggested how close the world had come to a different outcome. The case had changed the conversation about extremism, not as a distant threat, but as something that could incubate quietly, legally, patiently. It challenged assumptions about warning signs and forced agencies to confront a paradox. The more meticulously lawful the preparation, the harder it was to stop. Months later, a routine audit of digital evidence uncovered a final note appended to the checklist, time-stamped after the manifesto's completion. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a threat. It was an evaluation. A brief assessment of outcomes versus expectations. A line marked reach achieved. Another marked lessons learned. And a final sentence that froze the room. The method works. The response proves it. The realization landed with a sickening clarity. Breivik hadn't just committed an attack. He had tested a theory. And in his mind, the results confirmed it. The question facing investigators now wasn't how to punish one man. It was how to prevent an idea from adapting, mutating, and finding its next opportunity. Because if a theory could be tested once, it could be tested again. And the next person might be watching more closely. The sentence was final, but the silence it created was not. When Anders Breivik was led from the courtroom, Norway did not erupt in celebration or rage. There were no cheers, no riots, no theatrical release of anger. Instead, there was a collective stillness, a country trying to understand how something so deliberate had grown unnoticed in a place built on trust. The prison doors closed behind him, heavy and absolute. But for investigators, psychologists, and intelligence agencies across Europe, the case was far from over. Because Breivik had never designed his actions to end with his arrest. He had designed them to continue without him. Inside intelligence units, analysts replayed the same question late into the night. What happens after the attention fades? History offered uncomfortable answers. Ideas don't disappear when their authors are imprisoned. Sometimes they harden. Sometimes they wait. Breivik's writings were no longer treated as the ramblings of a lone extremist. They were dissected as a strategic document, one that outlined not just grievance, but process. How to remain invisible. How to stay within legal boundaries until the final moment. How to exploit institutional blind spots without ever appearing urgent. He had weaponized patience. Law enforcement across Europe adjusted their threat models. The definition of danger expanded beyond chatter and networks to include individuals who operated quietly, legally, and alone. Surveillance protocols were rewritten. Risk assessments rebalanced. Silence became a variable instead of an absence. But the hardest shift was cultural. Norway had always believed that openness was strength, that trust reduced violence, that community diluted extremism. The attack didn't erase those values, but it tested them. In the years following, schools added new discussions. Not just about ideology, but about vulnerability. About how radicalization didn't always arrive shouting. Sometimes it arrived politely, dressed as debate, masked as intellectual grievance. Survivors carried the weight differently. Some refused to speak Breivik's name. Others confronted it directly, determined to reclaim the narrative. They spoke about fear without glamorizing it, about loss without abstraction. They reminded the public that the victims were not symbols, they were people with unfinished lives. Each anniversary reopened wounds, but it also reaffirmed resolve. Utøya Island became a place of remembrance and education, not erasure. Young people returned, not to forget, but to understand. To talk openly about democracy, disagreement, and the fine line between expression and violence. Breivik, isolated behind prison walls, continued to file complaints. About conditions. About rights. About being heard. Each request reignited debate. Where does justice end and provocation begin? Courts responded with restraint. Institutions refused to bend theatrically. The spotlight dimmed, slowly, deliberately. That frustrated him. But frustration didn't stop the echo. Years after the trial, a Europol report quietly circulated among partner agencies. It noted a pattern, not of coordination, but of imitation. Attacks inspired not by Breivik's ideology specifically, but by his method. Lone actors. Extensive preparation. Minimal communication. A belief that impact mattered more than survival. The report avoided sensational language. It didn't need it. The danger was clear. Breivik had shown that a single individual could generate global attention without belonging to a group, without breaking laws until the last steps, without triggering early alarms. He had lowered the barrier of entry for those seeking infamy through extremism. That was his most lasting damage. To counter it, agencies invested in something far less visible than weapons or surveillance: prevention through disruption. Community reporting systems were strengthened. Online spaces were monitored not just for hate, but for fixation. Schools trained counselors to recognize withdrawal paired with obsession. Families were encouraged to take unease seriously, even when it felt abstract. There were successes. Several planned attacks across Europe were quietly stopped before they began. Not with dramatic arrests, but with interventions, mental health support, legal restrictions, community involvement. Stories that never made headlines because they ended without spectacle. That, some argued, was the real victory. Still, the question lingered. Could a society defend itself without becoming paranoid? Could openness survive in a world where silence could be strategy? Norway chose to try. Breivik's name faded from headlines. His writings were restricted, contextualized, stripped of performative power. The focus shifted intentionally to the victims, to resilience, to the idea that refusing to amplify hatred was itself an act of resistance. Yet in academic circles, his case remained mandatory study. Not because he was exceptional, but because he wasn't. He hadn't needed extraordinary intelligence, resources, or connections. He had needed time, grievance, and a belief that being seen mattered more than being right. That combination was not unique, which meant the responsibility didn't belong only to police or governments. It belonged to societies willing to confront uncomfortable conversations early, before fixation turned into planning, before ideology hardened into intent. A former investigator summed it up years later in a closed-door briefing. "We didn't just investigate a crime," he said. "We investigated a mirror. And not everyone liked what they saw." On Utøya, the water still moves gently against the shore. Trees still cast long shadows in the evening. Laughter has returned, cautiously, deliberately. Not because the past was forgotten, but because fear was not allowed to claim the future. The island stands as proof that violence does not get the final word. Breivik sits alone, his world reduced to concrete and routine. The attention he once craved has narrowed to footnotes and case studies. History remembers him not as a visionary, but as a warning of what happens when ideas are left to fester without challenge, when silence is mistaken for harmlessness. The attack reshaped how the world talks about extremism. It forced institutions to adapt. It reminded societies that danger doesn't always announce itself with chaos. Sometimes it arrives calmly, patiently, legally, and waits. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Subscribe, hit like, and leave a comment, because once this story starts, the world you know won't feel the same again.